everybody. As usual, we are back with another episode, and today is it's going to be a shorter episode, and it's we've titled it Orthodoxy and Diversity. And in a minute, Ed will be telling us a bit more about what we're going to talk about. And you'll notice that somebody is missing. Frances is not here, and but she may join us en route. So if you suddenly see this, hear this third voice come up, then it'll be Frances joining us sort of midway through. But until then, we're going to actually start and talk about today's subject. So Ed, you can fire away.
Well, this has been fired up by our 50 arguments for evidence for God book that we are kind of structuring a few shows around. And the randomizer has coughed up the Gospel of Thomas as one of the chapters to look at. And so I don't know how, but they think that talking about the Gospel of Thomas is valid as an argument for God. But it certainly opens up a quite interesting can of worms. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. Yeah,
well, I mean, I must admit, when I was reading the chapter on it, I was an interesting, almost like a side side road on something to bring up the whole Gospel of Thomas in what they were saying. So I suppose that was your thoughts as well.
They feel that they're on a sticky wicket when it comes to the Gospel of Thomas, and so they need to defend themselves. And that's why it's in there. Or maybe they would say, to be more generous, atheists have a go, and then these scholars like Crossman like the Gospel of Thomas and use it as a bit of a leverage to undermine the canonical Gospels, and that needs responding to.
Yeah, so I mean, if we step back a bit on this, anybody listening to this from whatever background, whatever worldview they've got, you open the Bible and you've got, the Gospel according to Mark, Gospel according to Matthew, actually in that order, and we've got the Gospel according to Mark, Gospel according to Luke, and then Gospel according to John, and then we turn and we don't have the Gospel of Thomas. So that really takes it back to what? There's a Gospel of Thomas and other Gospels are out there that were written a bit later. So maybe you could just start with what it is, what its history is, and what can we learn from it?
Yeah, well, I'll ask you some questions.
Okay.
The Gospel itself is interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that it's about 114 sayings with tiny little bits of context around some of them, most of them just nothing. Some of the sayings are a little bit familiar from the Synoptic Gospels, and some of them seem a bit weird, and scholars definitely see a second century influence in them. And what makes that interesting, just as an aside, because we probably won't pick up on it very much, is people have this argument about this Q document, Q for source in German, which is thought to be a document that Matthew and Luke are using along with Mark to write their Gospels. Mark Goodacre famously is in the most prominent person who thinks that's not the case. Luke just used Matthew. If there is a Q, then it might be something a bit like this Gospel of Thomas, but 100 years prior. But that's not really why the Gospel of Thomas is of interest to us for tonight anyway. And that is, it's scholars, if they're going to have 5 Gospels, this would be the 5th. So it's the most seriously taken of the second century Gospels.
Yeah, well, which raises the question that some actually do put it in the first. There is even scholarly debate on that. I believe Elaine-Pagels does, and Crossen, but I think not the overwhelming, but maybe the big view about it is that the Gospel of Thomas is a second century document in the same way that the Gospel of Peter is. It is interesting you mentioned that, by the way, because the Gospel of Thomas does come up. Which what was the point that you just made about the Gospel of Thomas? It was it's because of Q, people mooted the idea of Q, and people sort of at the beginning thought, well, we haven't got any evidence for any such an idea, and they said, well, we think Q is a book of sayings, that sort of thing, or at least the original sources of Q was a book of sayings. And then lo and behold, they later discover the Gospel of Thomas, which isn't the Q they were talking about, but it is a book of sayings, which they actually already suggested you might find a book of that nature. That's what I find fascinating. So that in itself, it's like, well, that gives credence to people having theories and ideas, and then suddenly something shows up that backs up what somebody has prognosticated, if that's a word you can use.
Yes.
For that. So anyway,
it turned up in, I think, the 19th century.
Yes. But there was references to it in the past, or versions of it and things like that.
Oh, actually, so we knew there was such a thing as the Gospel of Thomas.
That's right, yeah.
We could be slightly clear, because there's 2 or 3 versions of a Gospel of Thomas. This is the Coptic one. And I think there were some snippets that people didn't know what they were. And then pretty well the whole thing got found in a rubbish tip in the desert. In Egypt,
Egyptian sandy places, like preserving. That's what preserves these things over the years, hundreds and hundreds of years. I suppose it should be made clear that the Gospel of Thomas isn't like, if you did stick it after the Gospel of John, oddly enough, it does actually have some phraseology like John. Funny enough.
Does it? Okay, right.
It does.
I was struck by it. Felt
eternal life and it goes for. Some people like to say that the Gospel of John changes the apocalyptic language and understanding of I think we've covered this before, of the synoptics, which talk about God breaking into this world, reigning in a kingdom with Israel, in a sort of almost very literalistic physical kingdom in this world, whereas John turns it and makes it much more heavenly, spiritual, and eternal life is something you abide in now, not waiting for the future like the others. Except Luke has a bit of that, but bart-ehrman, for example, traces a trajectory, and then when you get here into the Gospel of Thomas, the actual immediacy of the kingdom is now directly challenged in the Gospel of Thomas, whereas it's alluded to in the Gospel of John, with this sort of born from above and everything's sort of heavenly and spiritual. And so the Gospel of Thomas does take that theme a bit further, and where it says that they're looking for the kingdom, and it's almost like it's like that Luke thing as well. It is within you, and it's not to be seen. It's here, sort of thing. The Gospel of Thomas, I believe, has elements of that in it very strongly, which some people then that shows you that it is a bit later than John. Some people argue that. But it isn't a gospel in the sense of a story that leads up to a crucifixion. It is a book of sayings.
And it's very keen on secrecy, and things are hidden and things revealed. Which makes me feel it's quite like Mark. So in that way, it's loop back to the very earliest one.
This is when I was reading that chapter, by the way, it's like, okay, somebody makes these points. Oh yeah, that's a good point. That could I think it's all agreed that it could be interpreted a little bit Gnostic, but there's other ways that it's not, and then those Gnostic ones could be looked at this way. So there's so much ambiguity that you do get scholars that make it early, and then you do get scholars that make it late, or even try to say that it actually knows the Gospels. A bit like you would argue that some people say the Gospel of John knows the synoptics, the same sort of thing. So it looks like,
and this whole word Gnostic we have to be very careful with these days, apparently.
That's true, very true. It's not just one number.
It's a very slippery term. If we talk about, if we just accept that it's extremely vague, that will probably do. We'll talk about kind of ideas about in a group having knowledge.
Another fascinating thing about it, though, which is interesting, is that because it's not a narrative in the same way as Mark, which has this almost, like some people call it, a massive introduction before the crucifixion. It's basically those sort of biographies. It's not like that, but funny enough, it's closer to how the Quran is, which is and ironically, the Quran's got 114 surahs. I know this is probably just pure coincidence, but why couldn't it have just been 112 in the Thomas and 114 in the Quran? It is 114, and it is sayings, which is more similar to that way of the Quran, funny enough, than actually the Gospels in terms of things. So I find that just like a thought pattern in my mind. I'm not making anything of it, but But there is something.
Obviously, it is mercifully rather shorter.
Yes, that's true. Yeah,
by orders of magnitude.
And so yeah. Anyway, so the Gospel of Thomas is seen. I mean, I think there are some churches in the world that do actually use the Gospel of Thomas, and so I think it was referenced actually in that chapter of the 50 Arguments for God.
So, what did you make of the evangelical scholar who was writing that chapter?
What do you make of him, or make of his points?
Well, make of the argument, yeah.
Oh, I see.
Of the points he was making.
Well, I mean, I know that the bit that sort of stuck out to me was the dating. It was like he gave the arguments that why some people thought it was an early document, and that if certain points were true about, I think he was going into how things evolve. And some people, I think, I'm not sure what the scholar who was arguing that it's old, it's a first century document and could even predate the Gospels, is because so there are certain aspects of evolution of way things are done that don't apply to the Gospel of Thomas, and therefore this would make it. So he said that if these things were true, then it would make it possibly a sort. And this is what Crossan, I believe, does. It sees that it's an earlier, or it's sourced in an earlier stuff that was going on. And this is where people probably think Jesus was this sort of cynic sage thing of a person going around with sayings, rather than the later. So that's what. So it does cause quite a big split in serious scholarship about this. But then he goes on to say, but this other scholar says, but it could. There's this pattern. I think he linked it to Tatian. When Tatian made in the 2nd century, I believe, or was it the early 3rd? He made all the Gospels into one Gospel.
Oh, right, yeah.
It's called the Diet. Yeah, and
yes.
that there was some link between the Gospel of Thomas imbibing something to do with that. I forget what it was now, but there we say, well, if you take that, then you think it's okay. So now we've got a 2nd century Gospel of Thomas. I mean, you can see why different people have to watch that without, if you're not going by evidence, then you can see why some people would want it to be late. Obviously, evangelicals, fundamentalists, don't want the Gospel of Thomas to be anywhere near close or even earlier than the Gospels, just from theological reasons. Let alone, you could see that's a bit that would possibly hinder any good evidence that was opposite. Equally, other people who don't have who do have a stake in probably thinking, well, we don't think the 4 Gospels, we think it's earlier, and it must have been something earlier, so it must be the Gospel of Thomas, and we'll make it earlier. There could be a bias that way, but it'd be just good to try and see what evidences there are that push it either way. And so I thought that I thought he was
you
fair.
Wouldn't want it to be. I mean, you get these like Crossman, who's kind of people feels quite left politically.
Yes.
But you wouldn't want the Gospel of Thomas to be part of the Bible if you're left leaning, because of it, the way it talks about women, especially.
Wow, that's interesting. Yes, that's right. I mean, we could probably read that passage out if you've got it to hand. I mean, okay, it's a very, I think Gospel of Thomas is possibly known, at least that you'll get the fundamentalists and conservatives bringing this out, and they'll say, this is crazy talk, so this might possibly been anything to do with the real Jesus, which I have an objection to, actually, but if you want to read it.
Well, I'll take me a while to get there.
I think it's it is the final saying. Or one of them in the Gospel of Thomas. And remember, Jesus is basically sayings, isn't it? Or I think there's questions and things from disciples.
Yes, okay.
And
maybe is
answers.
It just all self-contained in the very last one? Because
I think so.
I've got
Yeah.
that ready. Yeah. Okay. So this is 114.
Yeah.
Simon Peter said to him, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven."
Whoa. So that's quite something, isn't it? But I was, I think off air, if you remember, I was saying to you that I was in discussion funny enough, with Michael Green at one point about this, and he was saying, this is one of the reasons why people would have rejected it and everything else. And I'm thinking, I immediately leapt to, I think it's 1 Timothy, isn't it, where it talks about, I permit not a woman to teach, have authority over a man, for it was Adam that was formed first and that sort of stuff. And it's actually quite offensive to a lot of women today, even in the church. And then of course it's argued that author wasn't even Paul, and it was some sort of later person writing this very stuff sort of against women. And this here fits into, I mean, it's more extreme, of course, but it fits into that sort of packet. But then you're right, it doesn't make for an earlier sort of, if Jesus was in fact if the later church was basically clamping down on women's roles and ministry, then if this is in the Gospel of Thomas, then of course that wouldn't be, if there was a verse that said every woman is as equal as man, and they become one and they shall enter the kingdom, it would actually be better than the New Testament, you know what I mean? But it isn't. So that's what's often touted around. But
I think that's right. You get the feel, the nearer you are to the early, the more the more hippie everything is. Yes. And then as things go by and the church becomes more hierarchical and you need these sort of structures to keep an organization going. It becomes much more.
I think the other famous verse in here, if I'm not mistaken, is the one where he talks about who shall we go to, and he says you shall go to James. I think I forget where that is in here now, but if you look at it, and that was fascinating because a lot of scholars say, well, this is coming from a group that was actually aware that James was the one taking over the Jerusalem church, and it was those kinds of Jamesian Christians.
Yeah, who will be our leader? Yes,
who will be our leader? Now, wouldn't it have been amazing to say?
This is number 12 of the 114.
Okay, yeah.
The disciples said to Jesus, "We know that you will depart from us. Who is to be our leader?" Jesus said to them, "Wherever you are to go to James the righteous, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being."
Wow.
Yeah.
So that is amazing, isn't it? Now imagine, it didn't say, well, obviously the Apostle Paul, or even Peter. It's James. It's like this figure in this book is talking about James in such a high way that, in fact, in whose sake the kingdom, it's a bit like, I shall build this rock, like Catholics sort of say on Peter, the rock. This is a bit like that, but for James, almost left out in the New Testament. He's in the background, but left out as so this group will probably be backing people that aren't part of the what became Paul's churches, and then maybe even later Marcion's churches, I would imagine. So those are the two verses that really stand out when people talk about the Gospel of Thomas. And maybe the other one about the kingdom being right now, almost fully, and you're not looking for it in the future. That's the third aspect of the Gospel of Thomas. Okay. Now, I'd like to know where that is.
Well, there's something quite near the end.
I think he says, they're doing like a Luke thing. When will it be, or something like that?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
When will the kingdom come?
Yeah.
And Jesus replies, "It will not come by waiting for it. It will not be a matter of saying here it is or there it is."
Wow.
So that feels familiar to me from
well, actually, Matthew says there shall be people en route saying here it is, and don't follow them, and there it is, but it will come like lightning and all the rest of it. Yeah. But
anyway, then there's one more sentence to go.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Rather, the kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and men do not see it.
So this is much more called what would later be called in theology, realized eschatology, a bit like John.
Yeah.
Where something seems to be more present, ever more present, and now it's coming almost to a fully present kingdom, whilst the world is still going on, as opposed to, if you think about Mark, with the thief in the night and Jesus coming and setting up a kingdom and the judgment hitting everybody, that's the synoptics, apart from a bit of Luke now and again. That's generally the synoptic idea. John takes it this route, but the Gospel of Thomas seems to take it further this route.
Yeah.
It says not waiting
which
for
all
it,
helps date it later.
Yeah, whereas most evangelicals, fundamentalists are waiting for it. So it's like, rather than saying, well, the kingdom is here now and it's just spread about, people don't see it. You could interpret that as Christian stuff as well, if you wanted to, in a sort of a now and not yet way, as people like to do. But it is interesting that the language is moving away, or it's moving further in the direction that John was. Yeah. And to contrast this with Mark is actually quite interesting. Even though there's secrecy here and secrecy in Mark, which is a similar thing, So yeah. So,
now, what I'd like to talk about is just the sort of mechanics of all of this, and the Gospel of Thomas. We had no idea what was in it until the document was found 100 and whatever years ago. So you thought, well, it's the most minor, obscure gospel there is from that point of view. We've had Matthew, Mark, and everything, thousands of copies of them for centuries. But actually, the first full copy we have of Mark's gospel is in Sinaiticus, the New Testament, also found in Egypt. And then the other one, Vaticanus, is similarly dated, maybe 10 years later or something. And the copy of the Gospel of Thomas that they found in this rubbish tip near a town in Egypt was just about the same age, or maybe a tad earlier, I don't know. Then you have 2 or 3 little fragments of the Gospel of Thomas predating this, the full version, that in hindsight, having got the full version, you see these fragments actually are part of a Gospel of Thomas. Yeah. And you've only got 1 fragment of Mark that's of before Sinaiticus. So if you were going to have a kind of league table or hierarchy of how well attested a gospel is up to AD 350, which is Sinaiticus, Thomas would be marginally ahead of Mark. So it's only in later, when all the monks and the scribes, they kept copying Mark because it was interesting to them. It was orthodox. It was their scriptures. Thomas, they weren't suppressing it. They just weren't interested in it. And so it stopped being copied and it was lost. So I don't see there's any dark kind of Catholic Church suppression of the alternative voices. It's just the natural way that humans operate. And of course, copying is a very expensive thing. You only copy something that's really valuable because it's so
well, that's true.
Yeah.
But it's relative anyway, because Randall Helms, the guy who wrote Gospel Fictions, he was saying that same principle you just said was also the same, but relatively speaking, between the Matthew and Luke compared with Mark. There's a lot less of full copies of Mark, and there's a lot more apparently of Matthew and Luke. And he was saying that that's because people were less interested in Mark and more interested in the revamps of them by Matthew and Luke. And so Mark was not so. I mean, I think Mark is probably the most fascinating of them all, because it really, whatever Mark is, sets the stage for a lot, doesn't it? Yeah. So to me, it'd been the most fascinating gospel, Mark. Whereas, but if it was more relegated to the side because the others were becoming more popular, it's the same principle, isn't it? It's that Gospel of Thomas was the least one that they wanted.
Yeah. So we don't know how many people were reading Thomas. So from my tiny little, it's not really enough to base an argument, but it's possible that there was more copies of Thomas in circulation up to about 350 AD than there was Mark. We just don't know. And apparently, the scholar made a list of all the documents we know about, because they're referred to in the documents that we do have. And the majority of them are non-Orthodox, according to the looking back from when Orthodoxy kind of bedded down, which is about the 4th, 5th century. So there's certain documents like the canonical Gospels that were deemed Orthodox, or that the people who became Orthodox valued, and they became in the canon. But and there were loads of letters and diatribes and things by early church fathers or early apologists, and they were kept because they were interesting and agreed with the Orthodox people. And scholars or scribes have kept copying them, and they're still with us. But all these other documents that aren't saying the things that are interesting and useful to the Orthodox Christians later on, there are a lot more of those documents, not in terms of copies of them, but in terms of, the gospel of this and the gospel of that and the letter of so-and-so. There are more of those than Orthodox ones when you add it all up.
It also reminded me when you were saying that about reasons. I was listening to another podcast this week that brought up this whole Irenaeus thing, who was starting to make arguments that the four gospels were the only ones, and there's reasons for it, like there's four elements and things like that.
Four corners.
There's four. I don't know, four creatures in Revelation. Things that we read now, and we think, really, you could, if there happened to have been three, you might have found all kinds of things about three somewhere. Like you could have said,
well, there are lots of sevens in Revelation. So shouldn't there be seven gospels?
So 7 gospels would have been perfect, wouldn't it? So of course there's not going to be 6 or 8 because there's 7 spirits. You know what I mean? So it did seem a bit silly to me to say, well, there's making an argument for 4, because you could probably, you could make an argument for 5 or 6 or 7, but actually 7 would be the best, or 3. Mate, the 3 is also another number, isn't it? He would have said something like, it was Peter, Paul and James or something, Peter, Paul and John. Who were the 3, isn't it? It's Peter, John, and James, isn't it? Or something like that. As our Lord said, Peter, John, and James. Of course, that's going to reflect 3 gospels. So, so I didn't. But that's just because they were trying to sort of say, look, these other things that are writing, we now need to clamp down and say that there's 4 and 4 only. So obviously, by Irenaeus' time, about 180, we've got some tension with other people reading the Gospel of Peter and Judas, as I think you were going to mention.
Yeah. Well, I don't really want to talk about those. I want to talk about the big picture. And it's there actually in the chapter we're talking about by the 50 Arguments for God people, that they have this sort of unspoken assumption that we know what first century Orthodoxy was, and that's the yardstick against which we can compare the Gospel of Thomas and say, it's clear it's not Orthodox. But this just can't be justified. We just don't know what the texts were that people were writing and what they were thinking. And in fact, as we'll go on and talk about this, we've got every indication to conclude that there was a massive diversity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We touched a little bit into that in the Book of Revelation one, isn't it? So we'll come on that as well.
Yeah. Shall we talk about Walter Bauer? Have I pronounced it correctly?
I think it's Bauer. Yeah.
Bauer. Yeah.
I think Walter Bauer is a famous book in the 30s, I believe.
Yes, that's right.
So my understanding of that book in the 30s was a sort of a landmark book, like you do get books in history, a landmark on a particular issue. And Walter Bauer is the name associated with the book that sort of challenged the view that history was that Christianity started pristine and clear and true, and then heresies and factions split off later. So and sort of went astray from the truth, and it was like a one monolith truth from the disciples onwards, to rather the fact that right off the bat there was all these different groups, and disagreeing with each other and factions right off the beginning of trying to understand from the very beginning what happened, presumably. So do you want to say a bit more about that as well?
Yeah, well, it's called Orthodoxy and Heresy, his book. And I think he concludes really that it's more orthodoxy or just diversity everywhere. So there isn't this idea of an orthodox lot and heretics. It's more, there's loads of different people with different views, and when they write and speak, they take the position that they are the orthodox lot, and the other lot are heretics.
So it's like the winners of history. The winners write the story.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And that's what's happened with, I was talking about with these scribes doing all the copying later on. The documents we have, except for when we're really fortunate for something to be dug up in the desert, like the Gospel of Thomas, is stuff that the Orthodox Church has preserved for us. Orthodox not meaning Eastern Orthodox, but just the people who took on they won the argument, I guess.
Yeah. Actually, that reminds me of a particular principle as an example of this, because I know that I remember reading when I was very young some of these passages that talk about you are my beloved son, today I've begotten you. I remember thinking, oh, that doesn't quite fit with the theology, isn't it? That you were begotten at one particular point, because it was the unbegotten son, wasn't it? And now some of those passages, when they're quoted, I think in other parts of the Bible, miss out that bit, because a lot of the heretics by that time, so-called, were reading it like that. And of course, you don't want them to read it like that. So you sort of omit parts when you sort of pass a verse on. And that's an example of later church wanting to sort of and there's loads and loads of arguments, instances of this in the Bible, where they sort of tweaked it in their textual versions to help push it the way that orthodoxy was going. So it's I found that fascinating.
Yeah.
Rather than saying, well, we're reading the Bible and this is where orthodoxy is coming from, we're actually trying to push the Bible to where orthodoxy is going, with verses like that. Anyway.
Yeah. So I think what I'll do is I'll in the show notes, I'll do a reference to a podcast that I think is really helpful, discussing Walter Bauer and why he was so influential. And I like the point you made, is that he's a bit like Darwin or Freud in his field. Do you want to pick up on that?
I was making that off air about it, and I was just saying that what I've noticed when I was studying theology, and I've noticed this in a lot of areas, so it doesn't have to be Bible or theology or biblical criticism. It can be archaeology, science, cosmology, everything. That a big name comes along. Freud, for example, a big name, and Darwin, they have a landmark principle that almost everybody says is a massive contribution to how we now understand stuff. But all the edges and the furry edges and little bits and here and there that they said they've now don't agree with. That happens with Freud. That's happened with Bauer here. It's happened with Darwin. Darwin main basic principle is still what foundation of everything to do with biological evolution. But there are other aspects of his thoughts that people say, no, it's not like that. He didn't know about this, didn't know about DNA or stuff. And so this Walter Bauer in 1930, his essence of the diversity is still regarded as a landmark thing, even though some people thought he might have overstated the case and gone too far. And this is what happens with any major figure. But the fact is, he has shown that there was massive diversity at the very, very beginning. And that,
I think
second century.
Yeah.
And now other people have gone on to say, how did the second century happen? Was it sourced from the first, wouldn't it? And then keeps going. But you keep going back if you want to all the different groups of influences. But and I made the point as well when we were just talking about this, was that you can start actually. Bauer doesn't do that, but we can start with looking at Paul's own 7 letters that we think Paul actually wrote. And the factions that he seems to be talking about, like the super apostles and these other groups that seem to be thinking they are Christians, and Paul is totally against them, even calling them masquerading as angels of light and stuff, isn't it? I think it's the kind of language he uses, or the circumcision party are almost damned, it sounds to me, and yet we've got this story where James sends 2 people down who didn't agree with Paul, and caused a lot of tension. So you right off the bat, you've got people that have probably thought Paul was wrong, and it's right there in our Bible,
and wrong in big things, not in just sort of little bits of practice. Yeah.
Well, that's right. Yeah.
So there's these different groups, and one thing Bauer uses is the way that people give themselves names. So when it's you're a Christian. When it's the other lot, it's their their most prominent person or spokesperson's name. Like there's the Marcionites.
Marcionites.
Yes.
Or
Marcionites,
later in church history, Arianism.
Yes.
So
that's a way of making it sound like a heresy.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And so he talked about in Syria, which is obviously right next to Palestine. There were at least 3 groups, of which what later became the Orthodox lot was the smallest. There was Marcion, there was Pelagian or something like that, and the proto-Orthodox, I think is what we call them nowadays.
Yeah. Yes, it's sort of like the group that actually did become the Orthodox, but at the time when they were battling it out, they were all just a diverse groups. Yeah. Yes,
and they all call themselves Christians, and they call each other these other names. And Bauer found some documents where Orthodox leaders admitted that the Christians in this city or whatever who called themselves Christians were heretics from his point of view, and the proto-Orthodox lot were in a minority, and they weren't called Christians, they were called like Palladians or something. So it's all a mess from the point of view of someone who's trying to say that there was this sort of clear orthodoxy with these little splinter groups, like Mormons trying to do their different thing.
Yeah, it's funny with terminology, isn't it? Because if you go back even further, even Christians was actually the term used by other people for people that follow Jesus. And so it's I think I'm not sure if it's in the book of Acts, but they wouldn't have called themselves I'm a Christian. They would have isn't there a thing that they were part of the Way or something?
Yes, right.
Something like that. And there is, funny enough, there's a modern group called the Way, which is probably the most biblical thing you could do, because Christians would have been the not derogatory, but the term. Oh, who are they? Oh, they're the Christians. Yeah.
Yes.
So it's still throwing a term at them. They're idiot Christians, or well, bring the Christians into the lions. Rather than who are you? Oh, I'm a born again Christian. They wouldn't have said that. But maybe they said I follow Jesus, and as I mentioned earlier, I follow Apollos, I follow Paul.
Exactly. So
they were followers.
So they were the Apolloians and the the Pauline group.
Yeah. I mean, it's really weird because in Bible college, I remember it coming up saying, what he said to us, the lecturer, New Testament lecturer, he says, we're reading this passage, and everybody, he was playing a game really, because when we read it out, he said, now who have you? Which one is the right one? Everyone said, well, I follow Jesus as one of Paul's groups, and he was saying, well, that must have really had a different connotation back then, because it's put in the same thing as I follow Paul. Otherwise everyone would have thought, well, why are we following Paul and Apollos? It's obviously Jesus. It wasn't obviously that clear to how you use the terms in those groups back then. And I just remember thinking, well, surely we'd follow Jesus and not Apollos or Paul. But there were Christians then who didn't think that. And you probably would follow Paul if you didn't want to be part of that Jamesian group who didn't like not circumcision, and so it splits right off the bat.
Yes. And there is actually one very clear example in the New Testament, and that is the Nicolaitans. Who are a group that the author of Revelation is saying is a terrible lot. They'll be the interview.
Yeah, and others, like we'll get later on to the Jews, and we mentioned that in the Revelation episode as well. And can you imagine? I'd love to go back and find the Nicolaitans. You probably find they're the most great Christian group going, and they're just being attacked by this author.
Yeah,
I know. And so, or even the Jezebel woman, it's like, that you tend to think when you're growing up reading that, this is evil woman character. It could be a metaphor for something, of course, but just say it's an actual Jezebel woman. That's a horrible. You're just making, you're using that Old Testament thing about Jezebel being bad and putting it on someone. So Christians have never stopped doing this, have they? Calling everybody names. You do it today, those open theists, heretics, we do it today, those annihilationists instead of, the Orthodox. So it hasn't stopped. We're still diverse. We still call names to each other. And that's what they were doing back then. Yeah.
So I think it's pretty well, particularly when they start writing letters to each other. It's all over the place. This theme of fighting for correct doctrine. and the other lot have got it wrong. And I guess that's what happens if you, like particularly in John's gospel, you have the idea that if you believe the right stuff, then you get eternal life. So believing the right stuff actually becomes rather more important than it would do for other people.
Yeah, that's right. It's right belief became this dominant thing as opposed to even right behavior.
Yeah.
It's almost right belief. I mean, you can be put to death in later centuries for not having right belief. And that right belief could have been quite different than what Paul would have actually thought back in the day. I mean, I like to make this point. It's like, if there was this, just argument's sake, that tradition had said that there was this pristine truth right off the bat. Okay, so Jesus ascends up into the clouds. The disciples walk back and they say, right, we're all on board with the Trinity. Yep. Okay. You know what I mean? You can't, I just can't buy it for a second, because the arguments that came out were over circumcision, not the Trinity. So you either got two ways to go. They had no idea what you're talking about, and you hadn't even got there for hundreds of years, or they were all just so on board with the Trinity that it was pointless bringing it up, because they totally agreed that Jesus and the Father or the Holy Spirit were one. And then, so I don't buy it for a second. I think they would have had no idea about the Trinity as the disciples walked back. They didn't even really know, even all of them in Matthew, whether it really was him. So you said some of them doubted.
Yes.
I mean, so this idea of pristine truth from the beginning, I just find crazy. And so,
well, in different bits of the New Testament, you have Jesus becoming sort of Son of God or God at different stages.
That's right.
Sometimes it's at the baptism, sometimes it's at the resurrection, and sometimes he was there in the beginning and created the world.
Exactly. And that ties into that thing where I said, the only begotten, today I have begotten you, and that seems to apply at different points. And when people get later into the Trinity, you have this eternal generation of the Son. So he was always being begotten. Well, you can't have a moment where he wasn't the Son, do you see what I mean? So later other Christians believed those words, but Orthodoxy didn't take them that way in the end. And so so you're right. Obviously factions are going to happen because they were developing and evolving over decades and then hundreds of years,
Yes.
And it changed.
And another big thing that was going on was it started as a Jewish sect following Jesus, and by the 4th century it was entirely Greek religion. It was entirely Gentile religion, completely rejected the Jews. You would have to sort of reject Judaism to become a Christian by then, and so in that
it sort of switched in 200 years or less, didn't it, between it was a Jewish renewal movement, almost, you could argue, and Gentiles were coming in on board, joining the group in some sense. And even that's debated how that works and what that means. To 150 years later, where Judaizers were just completely anathema, weren't they? And apparently the Gospel of Barnabas, or the letter of Barnabas, goes into all of that. And if it was in the Bible, it'd be so strong against Jews.
Yes, I remember Steve Tompkins talking about this in his comedy routine over the church history, and it starts with the kind of communal meals rejecting Gentiles; they're not allowed in. And isn't it shocking, the idea of a Gentile joining in with the communal meals?
Yeah,
and
yes, that's
and
right.
then not 200-300 years later, it's completely the other way around.
Yeah, completely. I mean, absolute shock if you were, a Jew joining in. It's like, what?
Yeah,
get these people out of here. So that's how it sort of went. And wow.
So if you just imagine, if you're going on that journey and you're trying to get everyone along at the same rate, coherently believing the same stuff, that's just never going to happen.
No,
it can't even if that journey is valid, it's still, it's just you can't avoid a massive diversity of belief at any one moment.
Exactly. I mean, even in later, slightly second century documents that were having a poke at Paul, and there was documents that were attacking the groups that went Paul's way about the non-circumcision and all the rest of it, and the Jamesian way, which believed in Jesus as the savior, but it was to help keep the law, and all the laws of the Old Testament. And or as much as you could. It was a very, very different view. And so these different things were just neck and neck together. And it's argued, in fact, that when Jerusalem was destroyed, that's what really brought the Jamesian group to an end and allowed Paul's groups to bloom. And then later, Marcionism, I don't know how connected to Paul it was, but it might be, because of course Marcion loved Paul. And so or at least 10 letters, I think, of Paul. And so because the others, he didn't mention the other 3. And so these groups were completely got their sources that must have started somewhere in the 1st century to flower in the 2nd. That's the only way I can see it happening. I can't see something just happening overnight.
Yes, because people who say, oh, this is also Greek in the 2nd century, that's not the original 1st century Christianity. But all we know about first century Christianity, we know about is through the Greek language of them writing Greek documents.
Exactly, and
there are big Greek influences we can see in the New Testament.
Totally, and so the New Testament is written in Greek, even if there might have been some sources somewhere laying behind some of it, if it's argued that way, that are Aramaic. The fact is, they were Greek written; they weren't translated from Aramaic documents, and as far as we know, as far as the experts say today, and so that immediately you've shaped for whole Greek thought with writing, and you might just, you could just assume certain things from a Greek worldview, even if you're trying to write Jewish stuff. It's all mixed in, isn't it?
I mean, it is more Jewish than Greek. I think but it's got big Greek influence. It's
got a big Greek influence, and so of course you get more to the 2nd century, and of course Greek philosophy comes in more and more. But this idea of it suddenly coming in, and as if a gate was opened, and it was so Jewish before, like there was no influence. It doesn't seem to work with how life works, to suddenly see that the pristine 1st century, then suddenly hits, because Greek people would have been becoming Christians. Marcion churches boomed. Apparently, they were considered heretics by Christians, other Christians at the time. And yet they were booming because of a certain way of reading Paul's letters and looking at the Old Testament. So no different to today. You just have to look at the vast splits today of people seeing things differently and just arguing that this was how it started, the same way, misunderstood. If Jesus was misunderstood from the beginning, one group say, well, we've understood him right. Oh yeah, that was the point I was making. This later 2nd century document was having to go at Paul by saying, listen, it was just looking back in its argument, basically saying, look, I think they were pretending to be the disciples, and it's an earlier document, but it's not. But saying, look, we walked with Jesus for 3 years. We know what he was about. You claim to have had a vision of him. How do we know it wasn't a demon? That's what this 2nd century document says, apparently. Very good point. Very good point. They were walking around with him, and they were saying that Jesus said this. And then Paul comes along, has this great blinding vision, meets him in some way, but it's an after resurrection experience. And suddenly he's coming up with all this stuff about not needing to be circumcised. And they think, well, how do we know it's not a demon? And that's a valid point from a point where you think you're right and Paul is wrong, And so anyway.
Hi, guys.
Oh,
you did come in the end.
Oh, great.
I did in the end.
Yes.
I was having a senior moment.
Oh, we don't need to.
Okay.
Right, fair enough. Well, you might be able to come out of that and enlighten us on the Gospel of Thomas. And so Ed, you could just enlighten.
Well, we're talking now about slightly more the 1st century, Francis, and the diversity in the church that we're beginning to see there. And I'd like to just quickly go back to our last episode with Revelation and looking at some of the verses that we've been hinting at already, putting on the glasses of there is this diversity, and it's not an orthodoxy with a few heretics muddying things at the edges. So what we're talking about is the author of Revelation has sort of put himself up on a pedestal, as it were, as if by claiming to be a mouthpiece of Jesus. And then having got this sort of platform, he blasts away at some of the things he sees are problems in the local churches to the island where he's on. There's 7 churches in that eastern bit of western bit of Turkey. So I've got some little quotes from it. So to one of the churches, he says, there are some among you who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin, so that they ate food sacrificed to idols and committed sexual immorality. Likewise, you also have those who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. So that's one of them. So we've mentioned already how the Nicolaitans are a party. That's how they talked about a party of Christians. But actually, these could be bigger groups than the groups that are saying we're the lot in the right.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, Francis, before you came on, about when we mentioned the Nicolaitans, that if you went to them themselves, they could have been obviously themselves thinking that they were right Christians doing okay, and suddenly this author of this book is having a go at them, calling them names and all kinds of things. And so it's like everybody thinks they're right. Or you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't aim to be the wrong person. I want to be wrong.
I mean, I suppose I would say that you would think that if Jesus was who Christians say he is, that he was from God, that you would start with immediately after he ascended or whatever, everybody having a good strong agreement, because they'd all spoken, they'd all had contact with Jesus. There was a really solid message. And then gradually you might think that the law of entropy would creep in, and people would, the message would start to get blurred, but it was always blurred. That's what's so odd, I think, that it just seems like right from the get-go, people couldn't agree on who he was, what he was saying, why he was on earth. It just doesn't seem to line up with the Christian dogma. Or the current Christian dogma.
I just had to say what I did repeat said earlier was that I can't buy it either, in the sense that when Jesus ascended and the disciples were walking back, and they just sort of said, so we're all on board with the Trinity then, and do you know what I mean? And it's like no, nothing to talk about here, but I do have an issue with circumcision. So these different people, but ironically, they would have been the people that probably didn't like Paul, I think, right then, though, at that time. So anyway, so you're right, Francis. It all started off not like we would want it to.
So this foods in sacrifice to idols, enticing people to eat food sacrificed to idols, that's being blasted away at, is something that Paul pretty well did. He said it was okay to do it as long as you weren't causing others to stumble. So it could be that this is a Pauline group that are these teaching of Balaam and all that sort of thing.
We covered this, of course, briefly in the Revelation episode. And so of course it was like this was one of the ideas that some people feel Revelation is against Paul, by not having him on the 12 foundation stones. Is not there. This thing about the meat is there, and also the Jews who say they're not Jews. I think you're going to mention that. That also might be an attack at Paul and of his ilk anyway. So right there, we've got diversity in the book of Revelation. So we've got first century stuff, as we're talking about.
And then another letter, the rest of you in Thyatira, to you who do not hold to her teaching, and that's Jezebel, I think, who's just an allegory, and have not learned Satan's so-called deep secrets. So the secret thing makes you think of Gnosticism. So even here in this New Testament document, we've got pushback against this sort of secret thing, which is actually a theme in Thomas. And of course, the theme in Mark, as I've been talking about. So all the issues that Bauer found out about in the 2nd century seem to be there in the community of this document.
Yes, and I mean, that was why reading about Bauer, I was just quite surprised. It was like, well, yeah, is this news? Thought we all knew that they were, there was that Peter and Paul seem to have been at loggerheads in many ways.
Yeah. And then finally, those the third quote I've got is Revelation chapter 3, verse 9. Those who are of the synagogue of Satan, who claim to be Jews, though they are not, but are liars. And so that could be Gentile Christians.
That's right. Exactly. That could well be Paul's lot. And so I know, but the other major interpretation of that, of course, is that they are. It's the view that we outlined earlier when Barnabas is talking about, Jews almost being anathema, and so and the later church was very anti-Semitic, wasn't it? And so this is like that, actual Jews who say are not real Jews. It's the Gentile Pauline Christians, but I think it's the other way around. I think this group is people like Paul who say a Jew is one inwardly. These are the people that this author is attacking, so a Gentile is a real Jew if he believes in Jesus is what he's attacking, probably. So that would be my understanding of that.
So we've got evidence in the New Testament of different groups having completely different views and having big fights over it. So I'm wondering, Andrew, do people talk about the prayer in John 17 where Jesus prays that they should all be one? And he goes on quite a lot about that. Is that, do you think, riffing off an environment where by John's time there was all these different groups sort of out with knives against each other?
Yeah, it could be, I suppose. I haven't really thought about that. Although, funny enough, talking about the Gospel of Thomas, that saying in John does sound a bit like what would be in Thomas, isn't it? Sort of a saying like that. We shall all be one.
Yes.
I think, I mean, if obviously John itself is a very divisive book because it's an in and out group, isn't there? And it seems to be attacking Jews. There's the Jews, isn't it? It's used in there, isn't it? It's the Jews with this and the Jews with that. So it's also getting a little bit in-house name calling. And so it's splitting right there. So it's interesting. Then you've got a phrase like we should all become one, but that's like the inner group should all become one. So you can't have the inner group factioning. So, but you still got to have the outsiders.
Thinks, we all want to be one. So you all got to agree with me. A big thing for Christianity is who Jesus is. And we've kind of talked about that a bit, and it's an enormous topic. Another big thing for Christianity is how you get saved. The whole point of this is that we get reconciled with God, we're saved that way, or we get to heaven, we're saved that way, or the kingdom comes and we're in the kingdom. That's an enormously important thing that has to be addressed. Your version of Christianity has to have an answer for exactly how it is that you get saved. And yet, even on that one, there are enormous differences between these groups that we see even in the New Testament. And I think probably one extreme would be Matthew. Would you agree, Andrew?
What, that Matthew is what?
It's very Jerusalem church, Jamesy.
Yeah. I mean, the famous passage there absolutely is that there could not, we've just seen in Revelation that could be attacking sort of Pauline kind of type church Christians. The whole thing about not one letter of the law, those that teach the least of this are least in the kingdom of God. It can be seen that Paul's churches and his followers are teaching, not to basically not, whereas this writer is saying not one jot or tittle should go from the law, and anyone that teaches otherwise. And it does sound like when you read of Pauline kind of literature in Ephesians, or his followers are saying the exact kind of opposite things about the law than what Matthew seems to be saying. So you could see that Matthew is a Jewish Jamesian kind of writer, and it's not
Matthew who has the thing about the sheep and the goats?
Yes.
Yes.
Because that to me seems very significant. I mean, to me, that's such a clear indication that salvation is through works.
Yeah. So how do you get to heaven? The sheep go to heaven and the goats go to eternal punishment. How do the sheep get to heaven?
By giving clothing to the poor and visiting people in prison.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a different take on this. I remember it's like one of these things when I've sometimes do a passage and it's a very different kind of interpretation. But the sheep and the goats, to me, because of my eschatology, which is all to do with end time sort of study, it's very, very, very popular to use the sheep and the goats as just talking about doing good to all people and to mankind. But actually, there's some technical stuff going on in there. And this is why I take a different view than that, is because Jesus it's still doing actions, but he's actually sending the disciples on a missionary trip. Those that don't treat them well with hospitality, he spits their feet and whatever, and some judgment's coming. Those that welcome them in, sort of give them hospitality like food and water, are accepted. And so it's actually how they treat the missionary disciples is what is happening in the sheep and the goats there. So it's like, how do you treat the least of these, my brethren? The least of these, my brethren, are in fact technical term for disciples, not the average person out in the world. Like,
I can understand that interpretation, but it still does.
It's still actions.
Works.
Yes. It's still actions. It's not saying.
This famous sort of Protestant faith versus works debate.
Yeah.
And it's clearly on the work side.
Yeah, I always saw it, funny enough, when I was young, a bit like a Ben-Hur. There's a great scene in Ben-Hur where Jesus is carrying the cross and Jesus falls over. And I think Ben-Hur goes up and gives him a glass of water. And Jesus looks at him and then walks on and carries on. And I thought, there's salvation, and it's a bit like that. So it's still action, but it's an action towards him and his and disciples. So yes, you're right, it's still action, but it's not quite just doing good, which is how it's been generally seen. It's generally seen as if you do good to humanity, you'll get it. When I think it's specifically contextual to the disciples, but most people don't actually take that view, but it is there in the text as a possibility.
So we see from what you said, Andrew, on the that not one jot or tittle will be removed from the law.
Yeah.
We see from what Francis said about sheep and the goats being more about deeds and
actions. Yes.
Yes. And then, where is the doctrine of salvation by faith or salvation through Jesus dying on the cross for us? Yeah. Where is that in Mark?
Yes. It's all to do with repentance and belief in God, isn't it? And sort of these actions. Yeah, but where is the belief in his own? Well, that's yet to come from the heretic Paul.
Yes. There is this one verse which is in Mark as well.
Yeah.
And that is in Mark it's 10:45. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So that's the only thing you've got in either of those two gospels and it's in both, to think that there is some kind of traditional Christian salvation by Jesus dying idea. But actually that is coming off from a passage in a book called Maccabees, which is in the Catholic Bible, an apocryphal book. But it was obviously very important to the society at the time. And that talks about these martyrs around about the time Daniel was actually written, if you go back to a previous episode. So about 150, 60 or something BC, where there were these martyrs who refused to bow to the kind of Greek overlords. And it said that, let's try and get the quote, the tyrant was punished. Okay, go back a bit. Those who have been consecrated for the sake of God are honoured, not only with his honour, but also by the fact that because of them, our enemies did not rule over our nation. The tyrant was punished and the homeland purified, and they having become, as it were, a ransom for the sin of our nation, and through whose blood those devout ones and their death, as an atoning sacrifice, divine providence preserved Israel that previously had been mistreated. So these are normal blokes. They're not the Son of God dying on a cross. They're just martyrs, and they're being talked of in this sort of their blood and the sin of our nation. Basically, they were just heroes, and their death kind of prompted political outcomes that were good for Israel at that time. And the lovely phrase is, as it were, a ransom for the sin of our nation. So it's not like some pure, like Paul or William Lane Craig kind of philosophy theory as to how this is a ransom. It's just a sort of, it's admitting that it's just a sort of nice allegory or analogy or something like that.
Jesus was the hero to lead the way.
Metaphor. Yes.
A metaphor, not to be pressed into some sort of I don't know, clinical lawyer-like term that has all this meaning. That's yet to come. To put it all in there. No, it's right. I mean, the gospel...
So Jesus' death is Son of Man did not come to be served, but serve, but to give his life as a ransom for many. It's just basically being a good example. That like the Maccabean martyrs were.
Yeah, and that's very much a possibility, because this is
and that's what the context of the passage is. The passage isn't about salvation; it's about them having who's the greatest among you, and no, you mustn't do that. Whoever wants to be the first must be the servant of all.
So the reason for saying it is to do about being a servant of all, and therefore being the role model or the hero, I suppose. So people who are familiar with Maccabees and the way that it was kind of considered in the time would get the message that this isn't about salvation and atonement theory. It's about just a good example.
Which isn't there a school of thought in modern Christianity that takes that view?
There's an atonement view called the I forget what it's called now. But it came around about the 12th century, I think, which was the...
the ransom theory?
No, not the ransom theory. That was a much earlier one.
The good example
The good example theory, but there's a name for it.
Right.
There's basically
I call it...
three models, isn't there? There's four is satisfaction, the ransom, penal substitution, and then there's
6 or 7.
Well, you can keep going when you break them.
There's
down.
Old Testament.
Expects the Spanish Inquisition.
There's Old Testament sacrifice.
Well, hang on. Do you think there's one view that comes out of the church? Not even from the beginning, let alone now. It's a moral influence theory. That's it.
Okay.
There we go. So that would
call it lived art.
Okay, fair enough. Lived art. Jesus could have said that. Well, I'm going to live up some art now. But it's so that ransom bit used in the way that you've quoted back to the martyrs is in fact a moral example. And so moral influence would fit better than some kind of transaction of sins to him and impunity and all this business. Imputation. Sorry. It's all later theology.
Yes. Anyway, so that Matthew's lot, it would seem to me, or Matthew himself, and he got credence and people liked his gospel. We're seeing salvation as nothing to do with believing the right stuff about Jesus dying on the cross. It was something completely different.
And the same with Luke apparently as well. Luke misses the themes of later Christian doctrine, even with the parable of forgiveness, he doesn't, when he forgives the the prodigal son, he doesn't say, right, I now need to go and sacrifice this lamb so that you can be forgiven, and he doesn't do that. He just welcomes him back, so it doesn't quite fit the way that we've later theology talked about forgiveness.
Before we finish, is it worth talking about the one New Testament, one first century document, Christian document we have that isn't in the New Testament, which is the Didache?
Yeah, that's right.
It's not a holocene, but it's might be worth just mentioning
again. If anything, that may have sort of it being more in line with the Jamesian Christians, not Paul's. So James Tabor argues that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So most scholars date it well into the 1st century.
Yeah.
And it's another one of these things that no one, that they knew that it existed, but no one had a copy of it.
Yeah.
Until one was found. Actually, it was scribes copying. It was a sort of 11th century or something like that. Document turned up again in the Victorian times.
Yeah.
And it's a very kind of rules based to me when I read it through. It's all about how you should fast, how you should conduct the Eucharist, how you should.
Yes, it's not so much about right belief, is it? Oddly enough.
Yes, it's all about right practice.
Yeah, right practice. Yeah. It would have been odd if it was in the Bible. He obviously read it. But yeah, a fascinating book.
I mean, interesting that it says, if you do these things, you should be perfect. Because one of the arguments made by people who put forward justification through faith alone is that you can't be perfect. You can never, you can never aspire to that standard, and therefore you need the sacrifice of Jesus to make good the imperfections that, however hard you try, will remain. And yet here's something saying, you do this, you do this, you do this, you're okay.
You'll be perfect as your Father is perfect. It doesn't sort of fit, does it? And this is the problem with the Gospels. They tend to have sayings that do not nicely fit, like this sheep and the goats one, like the prodigal son, like be perfect, like it just doesn't fit, because all this original sin and Adam and everything else was all kind of came in a bit later than these original sayings would imply, Otherwise it would say something nice and accordant, wouldn't it? It says you cannot be perfect because when you sinned in the garden, and rather than be perfect, it's like, what? So
then it needs a lot of spin put on it to explain how you fit it in.
Exactly. Or like not one jot or tittle of the law shall pass away, implying not just keep some major ones, keep them all. That's the implication, it seems to me, or keep them all in the right way.
It's like a jigsaw where you're just determined to fit that bit in. You just, when it won't fit, you just get a hammer and sort of hammer it into place. And then there's another bit and you hammer that into place.
That's right.
You end up with
it's square pegs in round holes, isn't it? And
it's
like, well, it's Matthew is the same Holy Spirit writing it as Paul, so somehow these square pegs need to be made round, and we'll do it. By golly, we'll do it. And how do you do it? By factioning off into different groups and fighting over it. You're changing scripture, you're not being scriptural. Well, we are, but we have these ones over here, not those ones over there.
I'd like you to do a YouTube channel, Andrew, of Christian diversity, but all 1st century.
Wow, how would you do that?
Well, you couldn't, because we've only got the small.
You can only
documents.
Exactly. You just have to have like images of documents and say, well, this is what Matthew says, and this is what. You can do all these Bible quotes against each other.
But I imagine a real Andrew who's there with his technology in the 1st century, interviewing people or doing clips of preaching like you do. You could do. That's right. You just say, well, I've just been to one of Paul's churches, and they were saying that actually the law is now moved on, and we just need to believe in Jesus and not keep the law. Matthew's group would say, well, you're in the wrong church. You need to come over here where we do. Jesus helps us keep the law. Oh, okay then. So let me try that this Sunday. Actually, it's not Sunday, it's Saturday. So that's right. Oh no. Oh, well, we do it on Sunday. Oh wow, you're a heretic. Yes. And you lot are Jezebel and Jezebel synagogue of Satan. Jezebel spirit. And what about the church? She said, well, we believe Jesus is coming back to reign in Jerusalem. Well, we don't. We think the kingdom's here already, and just people don't see it. What? That's Thomas' group, So is he here or is he not? And so right off the bat, this is what we're talking about. Right off the bat, as you said, Francis, it is diverse. Yeah. So great. Well, I think we've pretty well covered that sort of early diversity idea. It's only an idea for anyone listening to go off and say, oh, I want to find out about that. Was it really that diverse? Let me go and have a look. Yeah, well, the trouble is, there's not that much to have a look at because all the documents have been lost.
Yeah, that's true. But there's just little nuggets here and there.
Yeah, it's a little hints and
Yeah.
Yes, with Stalinist efficiency, the early church lost a lot of the divergent.
Well, the history
material.
Winners write history, don't they?
Yes, I go for the kind of cock up rather than conspiracies.
Right, just lack of interest.
Yeah.
I don't know. I do go a bit for the destruction, but who knows? We can only speculate, can't we?
When they hid those things in caves. They must have been hiding them for protection.
What you mean the Qumran lots?
Yeah. And so, people are going quickly, put them up here, because they might, presumably, you only had other parts of history where people were book burning all the time, didn't they? They didn't want your literature out there. Protestants doing Catholics.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. And so you get these groups that, burn a library, you want to get rid of it. And many Christian places were built on top of pagan places, weren't they? Just to get rid of it and make it Christian, So I think, there's all that sort of interesting stuff. I'd said before you came on, Francis, that I must find out what this book is, but there's a 2nd century book, I believe, that is arguing against Paul. And they were saying that I think the writer of the book is pretending the disciples are saying this and saying, we walked around with Jesus for 3 years. You had this vision. How do we know it wasn't a demon? Yeah. Oh. And so,
so that's a real 2nd century book.
That's a real 2nd century book.
Oh, that's interesting.
Simon Magus is being
you must
used
get
for
that
Paul.
in the show notes.
I must get that in the show notes and find out what it is. But it's like, I read it in Bart-ehrman quoted it, and then I went and looked it up. This was a lot years ago now. And I thought, wow. So there were people, obviously it wasn't the disciples that were saying that. This is the writer pretending they were, if you know what I mean. But it was still means it was a 2nd century thought that Paul was off the rails and that he'd had these visions that could have been a demon, because the real truth is those that walked with him for 3 years, that they knew what Jesus was talking about, which wasn't the same thing as Paul. So it shows that in 2nd century there were those groups that were anti-Paul. And obviously there's groups, you can even get it in the New Testament, that were anti-circumcision group. What did Paul call them? He quite harsh.
Circumcision group, weren't they?
Yeah, but he called them some harsh names.
Wouldn't they? Don't they go the whole hog and emasculate themselves?
Emasculate himself, something like that. Yeah. And so he was.
And he talks about super apostles. Is that the same lot?
Well,
kind of
there's a debate. There's a debate on that, but I tend to think there is more to it, that these super apostles, by the time Paul was losing the plot a bit in 2 Corinthians, that the super apostles may have been, in fact, James and Peter and John, because he was getting so annoyed with. But some people say it can't possibly be them. But James Tabor makes a very good case that it is. That he's saying that, even if because who are the super apostles other than those in our minds? There must have been these mysterious ones otherwise, but they obviously thought they were Christians and apostles, and they weren't teaching what Paul was teaching. So he talked about masquerading as, so it looks like Paul might have had far more serious antagonism with the original lot than say Acts makes it look like. Or later,
so maybe he was sort of struggling with an inferiority complex because they actually met Jesus and he hadn't.
Yeah, that's right. He says, well, I shouldn't need anything to recommend me or something, because, if these super apostles can come and do it. But he was totally against them, wasn't he? It seemed at one point, 2 Corinthians.
Yeah.
But some people don't take it as really about them, but it's getting pretty close to being circumcision party people, Anyway.
So there was something called the circumcision group in Galatians, according to the NIV.
That's right. And then Peter, James sends 2 people down, and those people are against Paul. And have you not noticed in the book of Acts where Luke, the author, says something very strange when you really read it critically? In the book of Acts, right at the end, they talk to Paul and they say, Paul, we have heard that you teach the abolition of the law. This is not true, is it? Basically. And then Paul, so Paul goes into the temple, doesn't he, to show that it wasn't true. And yet actually the accusation sounds remarkably like Paul's own letters. And so it's like the author of Acts is trying to sort of blend these, because he says all these people have become Christians and they are zealous for the law. Paul, you're on board, aren't you? That sounds like the text to me. That's what it sounds like. I think it's Acts 15, or is it Acts 20? So it sounds like to me, one day I was reading it, and I was thinking that accusation sounds remarkably like Paul. So it really hit me, and I thought, so why was he sort of bending and going into the temple as if he was saying, no, I'm zealous for the law as well? and to keep the peace. And as long as you can be zealous for the law and a Christian, then there's no problem, it seems. But the way they described the rumors, how I read Paul's letters, which is interesting. So there you go.
Yep. Okay,
anyway.
I think we're sort of
Yeah.
need to wind up a bit. So
Yeah. We're heading into the 3rd century as we speak. So that's right.
I'd just like to mention we've had an email from Dory Smith, or it might be Dory. I apologise if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, Dory. And she asked if we would do an episode on the historical Adam and Eve. I think you'll find if you go back through our back episodes that we have already covered the historical Adam and Eve, and that was episode 22. So go back and see if that meets what you're what you'd like us to cover. Feel free to get back in touch if you want to raise any other observations about it. We're always interested to get feedback and hear from listeners with comments and suggestions. But you may find that we've sufficiently covered it in episode 22.
great. So thank you for that. And it's been lovely chatting to you, Andrew, and for a briefer time, Francis. So thanks,
Francis, thank you for gracing us with your presence and adding some very, very insightful comments as we were, Head and I were sort of
well, I always say it's quality that counts.
It is, and that quality last 20 minutes was just fantastic, so thanks a lot. So until next time, I have been Andrew, your host,
and I've been Ed,
and I've been the latecomer, Francis.
Bye.